It's official, Japan has just entered recession. In fact, it's bad enough to lose Japan its spot as the world's third largest economy. The land of the rising sun now joins the UK and soon Germany and the rest of Europe in recession. China, of course, is already in deep recession. The US naturally is safe because Joe Biden spends between 2 and 3 trillion of your money pumping GDP numbers with migrant welfare and artillery shells for Ukraine. Japan's cabinet office announced the numbers last week, reporting that GDP shrank a worse than expected 0.4% in the last 3 months of 2023. That was a huge miss to the expected 1.4% growth, meaning mainstream economists in Japan are as bad as they are here. That miss came after GDP shrank 3.3% in the previous quarter. Now, for almost a century, 2 negative quarters of GDP is the definition of a recession. Of course, here in America, we famously broke that rule in 2022, since midterm elections were coming and Bidenomics needed some good press. And so our regime media obligingly gaslit the recession into oblivion. As Charles Payne tweeted, quote, back-to-back negative GDP quarters only count for the UK and Japan, or as CNN obediently puts it, 2 quarters is typically a recession. Typical as in if there's no important election coming up. So what's driving the pain in Japan? Domestic demand and consumer spending were weak, with only exports doing well thanks to a ridiculously cheap yen. Private consumption, which is half the Japanese economy, plunged almost 1% on the quarter as prices jumped, especially for food and fuel, which is also a consequence of that ridiculously cheap yen. Meanwhile, Japanese wages failed to keep up. In short, as in America, Japanese are falling behind in real incomes and they're not buying anymore. For them, it's the yen. For us, it is the bozos in Washington. So what's next? Brought to you by Unchained.com. Beyond the recession, the problem with weak GDP numbers in Japan is that it ties the hands of Japan's central bank, which had hoped to fix that collapsing yen by hiking interest rates. So currently, Japanese rates are roughly 0%, which means investors can make a lot of money pulling their cash out of Japan and buying US debt that pays 5%. That means trillions of yen for sale, which drives the yen down. So it's currently bumping around 150 per dollar, which is a number last seen in the 1980s. While a weak yen is good for Japanese exporters and bad for US manufacturers, the main problem is what it does to consumers in Japan. So Japanese people import 2/3 of the food they eat and 94% of their energy. So that's heating, air conditioning, gasoline. So a yen at 150 means those things can jump by 30%. So far, importers have held off raising prices, praying for a miracle from the Bank of Japan. That miracle just got a lot dimmer. Now, zooming out, this is turning into a global recession. I mentioned recently that Germany and Europe are deindustrializing. They're also apparently defarming. China is stumbling from crisis to crisis. The UK is already in recession. Australia and Canada are barely growing. Meanwhile, inflation has been resuming its grim march. It's accelerating again in Europe, while US inflation has gone from an annualized 1% in October to almost 4% today. Now, the last time we saw a coordinated global stagflation was 1970s after Nixon broke the gold standard and half-killed the golden goose. What the COVID spending orgy did to governments and central banks could finish it off. Okay, we'll be watching. See you next time.